This story begins like so many good stories in the world begin, in a first-year dorm on UBC campus called Totem Park Residence. I was 18. Yeah, woo. I was 18 years old when I moved in, and I had one goal in mind. I was going to be the UBC top dog. This required a few things. I needed to work really hard, and I needed to stay away from the partiers. You know, the partiers. The guys in those movies about college with the red plastic cups. Those guys. I was not going to be friends with those guys. This is where I met Phil. Now, Phil is a really talented partier. Very outgoing guy, very social, very raucous. Yeah, I met him in my first week of school, and I knew we were not going to be friends. A few years later, I get a message from Phil. We are still friends. I'm here at a very comfortable office job, and Phil had just single-handed a boat from Victoria, BC, over to Melbourne, Australia, over the course of 2 years. He sends me a message because he has a new adventure in mind as soon as he touches ground in Australia. Joe, do you want to race to Alaska? Yes, I do. What's the plan? Okay. I'm in. Let's do it. What we had just committed to was the first ever race to Alaska. This was an inaugural journey, 750 miles from the northern tip of Washington state up to Ketchikan in Alaska, a small town. We'd be going through the Inside Passage of BC, spanning the entire west coast of Canada. Now, as a race, and all races should, it has an awesome prize, $10,000, a wad of cash that had been nailed to some tree on the coast of Alaska. Sure. Second place prize got a set of steak knives. We are in. I had never sailed a boat before, so a few things needed to happen. By March 2015, Phil had moved back home to Canada. I had bought a book on how to sail, and together we had rustled up some really great sponsors, namely just our parents, and we had bought a $2,000 catamaran. Now, catamarans are very open and very exposed. Ours was 18 feet, 2 pontoons held together with a crossbeam and a little bit of fabric. Sure, this sounds great. We found out the competition had a little bit more going on. $200,000 trimarans, down to even a single-person kayak. We're all going to participate in this race. Now, this race has one important rule. There are no motors allowed. This was a boat race in its purest form. Only human or wind-powered boats. Because of this, we took an old bicycle crank and affixed it to a propeller and found out we could go pretty fast with this. We were going to do well. We were very, very optimistic. Along with that, let's just talk about what boats need. Boats, when they're going through rough weather, they make the worst lurching sounds. Every single line, every single point of contact makes its own discrete screeching sound. This was going to be a problem. We were very determined. Phil especially was very optimistic. I was actually quite set on becoming famous from this experience. I was going to be featured on Ellen. We would be known for how hilarious and how adventurous we are. I would write a book. I would blow John Cracker out of the water, and I'd probably be featured on Ellen again because my book, obviously. We would also have so much time to think about deep philosophical issues, because that's what adventures are all about. I would come up with my personal life's journey. This was going to be great. We had so much time. Of course, there was also boat stuff that would have to come into play. Instead, going through adventures, it's not all guts and glory. We actually had to think about pretty substantial things like food. And you know what? We actually probably didn't look that cool. Well, okay, we looked pretty cool. Myself, I did not get through that life's purpose whatsoever. Instead, I was kind of looking at some really hard knock stuff. Oh. On June 4th, 2015, We set sail on what Phil thought would still be an epic adventure and what I had calmly just accepted as certain death. We actually started out doing pretty well. By the time the sun rose on our second day, we found out that we were second place out of 45 teams. Yeah, thanks. We had two methods of communicating to the outside world, a VHF radio and a smartphone. Our VHF radio was bringing some pretty bad news. Northerly gales were about to hit us, and they were going to settle in for a full week. Now, a gale is the wind speed of 63 to 87 kilometers an hour. And a northerly gale, well, if you're trying to get to Alaska, it's going to be pointing right on your nose. Because we were so optimistic, we decided to camp out for a little bit. We decided to camp out on a beach in Powell River, BC. We thought we would maybe wait out the storm for a night, maybe two. Camping is a very glamorous way of putting it. We had nothing. Our boat was very light. Because of this, we could only bring a few necessities: the clothes on our back, a little bit of food, and a little bit of water. We set up camp, and we used a sail as a sort of blanket. Now, there was a few other things coming down through our VHF radio. Boats were dropping out in droves. Out of the 45 boats that had started the race, 20 had already dropped out after 48 hours. Masts were breaking. Boats were sinking. There was even a Coast Guard rescue. We decided to press on. On our third day, we found ourselves in Discovery Passage. Discovery Passage is a narrow inlet of water between Quadra Island and Vancouver Island, and it's where all the wind hitting the west coast of Canada gets funneled down into a narrow passage. Now we are up against this, huge waves, and the water, where it has its own mind of its own, it's going about 15 kilometers an hour. There's only so long that boats can kind of throw themselves at this kind of weather. So we decided to camp out for one more night. And we started to get really creative with where we were living. We wanted to be comfortable. The wind was still blowing the next day, so we ended up spending 2 nights there. On the 6th morning of our journey, we were woken to the sound of the Coast Guard hailing us from just offshore. They had a big megaphone out. "Joanna and Phil?" Yes? "Joanna, your mother is very worried about you." "Mom, cool boat race." Stop it. This actually did help to motivate us, though. We decided to make a go of it. We were 10 minutes away from shore when we got hit by a rogue gust of wind. Our boat went over, and we turtled. Now, if you imagine what a turtle looks like on its back with its arms flailing helplessly in the air, it's kind of what happens to a boat when it also goes over. Phil and I found ourselves standing on the underside of our boat facing skyward. Everything seemed okay, but we were still moving at a good click. The wind and the waves were about to push us into a very rocky island. I get on the VHF radio, I'm start calling a mayday to Coast Guard, and Phil grabs our one knife, takes a big breath, and submerges himself under the boat. Our boat is full of tension. Phil needs to cut a line, reduce the tension in the system, so that when we hit the rocks, our boat won't just brittly break into tiny, tiny little pieces. Well, Phil doesn't end up cutting a line, and we do end up hitting the rocks. We hit barnacles the size of tennis balls. In this kerfuffle, the boat actually does start to right itself. Phil is still attached to the boat, and suddenly we see our mast, fortunately, unscathed, pointing skyward. The wind suddenly hits the sail, and the boat is off, and I'm still bobbing in the water. So funny. Phil throws the safety line, and in the nick of time, I swim and grab it just as it's about to reach out of reach. As I'm pulling myself to this moving boat, I take one look behind me, and I see a lot of stuff in the water. Our shoes, a little bit of food, and all of our extra supplies. There's no going back for it. We head to shore, and we start to lick our wounds. In that moment, as soon as I saw the boat was about to hit the rocks, I wasn't worried about death anymore, thank God. I wasn't worried about getting hurt. The only thing I was worried about was not getting to Alaska. That's, after all, what we had set out to do. The next day, We patched up the boat and had a new game plan. On day 8, we found our weather window, and we made a break for it. We didn't stop moving for the next 550 miles, all the way to Alaska. It was exhausting. It was very cold. We were wet all the time. Everything was wet. Our hands were so swollen that skin simply seemed to melt away. Our faces, after hours and hours of being pelted with salt water, also started to peel. And the inside of our mouths developed some really weird sores. It was too cold to sleep and sail at night. So we had to take the sails down, and we would use our rickety pedal system to move through the night. We couldn't sleep for more than 30 minutes at a time. If we didn't move, we would easily succumb to hypothermia. So we would take shifts on and off. Phil would sleep, and I would pedal. Our feet, going through the same thing, also kind of succumbed to erosion. Bits of skin were falling off, and we lost a few nails. Despite this, it was a beautiful part of the world. We would see 10 to 20 whales a day. Sea lions the size of our boat would play in our wake. And let me tell you, after spending a whole dark night on the boat, a sunrise was the most beautiful thing in the world. We reached Alaska on the 15th day of our voyage, one of 15 teams to make and complete the trek. We did not get that wad of cash, and we did not get that set of steak knives. But we did come in 8th place overall, the first out of 20 teams, or the first boat under 20 feet to come in. There was one moment, we were up the northern tip of Vancouver Island in a place called Telegraph Cove, and it was absolutely stunning. It was the middle of the night, it was during one of my pedaling shifts, and the stars were lighting up the rugged coastline, and it was absolutely quiet except for the sound of breaching whales all around us. It was beautiful. And all I could think was, why? Why am I doing this? What do I have to prove? I have a comfortable life, I'm happy. Why am I willingly putting myself in harm's way? Fortunately, I didn't have to look far to find the answer to my question. I didn't have to look far because our boat is really small. Not 2 feet away from me, in the dark, a slowly heaving mass of human, Phil. Phil. I did this race because of Phil. I did this race because Phil asked me to. I had this experience because I'm lucky to have someone in my life who slaps me in the face when I get too comfortable and says, "Get off your butt, let's go do something fun." When differences converge, amazing things can happen, and you too could even sail to Alaska. I personally guarantee it. When differences in relationships are overcome, it's those very people that will push you beyond your brink, motivate you, and inspire you to do things that you didn't think were physically possible. I have not set foot on a boat since. But if you're ever wondering what direction Alaska is in, I know a guy. Thanks very much.